The kind of the headlines, I would say, for those of you who weren't in the room, is that people with IDD are really undercounted and quite underrepresented in our housing and our homeless systems of care, and kind of the safety net generally, I would say. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And the data study is actually pretty compelling to read if you would like to do that. Cooney Foundation actually sponsored that study a couple of years ago, and specifically to better understand, in kind of keeping with Cooney's mission, kind of how do we do better by housing folks with IDD and our neurodiverse neighbors. And so one of the agendas that came out of that data study and some community stakeholder work was this idea that we really need to bridge the gap between affordable housing providers and the service providers who help folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities live as independently as possible. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So some of you may know that we have actually a pretty troubling history, both in this country, but certainly in Oregon as well, when it comes to housing for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We institutionalized folks. We had the Fairview Training Center used to be the home for the feeble-minded. And it turns out it wasn't a great place to live, but it operated in this state for close to 100 years. It was chronically underfunded, very much overcrowded, and it was, came to be a place where people were not treated humanely. There was abuse, and there's a really troubling history about that. We're going to explore that more in a panel tomorrow about fair housing. So if that history is interesting to you, I would encourage you to come to that one as well. It's Thursday afternoon. So 30 years after the ADA was signed into law, and 23 years after Fairview closed, we still have deep disparities with this population. And housing supports have not kept pace. And the data that is used to make policy and investment decisions is really outdated and unhelpful. Okay. Whoops, good heavens. So what we learned in the last session was that the majority of folks with IDD are actually living at home with a family, with their families. And more often than not, that's an aging parent who is their caregiver. There's still a decent share that live in group homes, and a very small percentage actually live independently. And that's not because more don't want to live independently. That's because there are not housing options for this population. And so one of the kind of housing insecurity measures is very much about this idea that folks are living at home with caregivers, and that is not a sustainable solution. So more definitely needs to be done. Good heavens. I'm just going to have my friend back there do this. All right, nope, not this one, back one. So one of the things, there's a couple of things we want to highlight for you, and the speakers will cover this. But I think it's important to stress that folks with IDD are actually entitled to support services funded through state mechanisms. And those services are very explicitly designed to help them live where they want with as much independence as possible. It includes case management services and brokerages, which you're going to learn a little bit more about as well, that provide individualized services wherever the person lives. There's kind of a whole ecosystem there that's separate and apart from the housing and homeless systems. And they're disconnected and really distinct in a way that, to my mind, is not helpful from all this permanent supportive housing policy agendas that we're very focused on in this state for good reason. But we think there's probably room to move the policy a little bit there. And the other point I want to just underscore is that the housing shortage that you all are working on is hitting this population that's pretty vulnerable in a lot of ways, disproportionately. With that, I'm going to ask for the next slide. And our next speaker will introduce herself. She is joining us by Zoom from Eastern Oregon.
Good morning. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, Laura, we got you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So this feels a little bit nerve-wracking because there's a whole room of people and I can't see them. And it also feels very high-tech and cool. I'm sitting at home today, and I live right on the Columbia River. So out my window, I'm looking at Washington, but I'm sitting in Oregon. And for whatever reason, that makes me happy on a daily basis. So my name is Laura Knoppenberger. I'm the executive director of Eastern Oregon Support Services Brokerage. And I'm not with you guys today. Unfortunately, I have a lung infection and I didn't want to bring germs into the room and make anybody uncomfortable or hack. So I really appreciate you guys allowing me to do this via Zoom today. This feels very cool. So I'm very honored. And I really appreciate the Cooney Foundation and all of the sponsors for pulling this together. There's been a lot of excitement building around this conference. And so I'm really happy to be here today. I've been supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities for more than 20 years now. And Eastern Oregon Support Services Brokerage, we are a case management entity. We're a nonprofit, and we contract with the state of Oregon to provide supports for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who reside in their own or family homes in 13 counties. So we have quite a large catchment area. If you want to move to the next slide. And let me know, does this work? You guys can all hear me okay? I'm going to assume that's a yes. Okay, so what is a brokerage? As Margaret indicated previously, we have brokerages and we have county case management entities. So we have a plethora of services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the state of Oregon. And what's really nice is that people's services are portable. So if somebody decides that they want to move from Malheur County to Lane County, on the back end of things, brokerages and case management entities will coordinate that so that the person's services follow them. They can move anywhere in the state of Oregon and receive Medicaid funded services, which is really nice. Those services don't extend outside of Oregon because every state has their own structure, their own set of services, their own waivers. So the brokerage system is pretty unique to Oregon. But a brokerage, there are 14 brokerages in the state of Oregon, and we are mostly nonprofit organizations. We are community led. So what that means is that I have a board of directors, and my board of directors is comprised of people that my agency serves, as well as their family members. In fact, the majority of my board are self-advocates and family members. We have a few community partners as well who are interested in ensuring that people are successful in their communities. All of the brokerages, all of the case management entities, and I'm going to continue to kind of use these terms interchangeably, only because case management entities and brokerages, we all provide services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are some distinctions, which I'm not going to get into the details on. But I will say one of those distinctions is that case management entities provide services from birth to death for individuals who are eligible, whereas brokerages serve adults who are 18 and over, who are choosing to live in the community, live in their own homes or family homes. All of us contract with the state of Oregon. So we all hold contracts with the Oregon Department of Human Services to provide case management services and facilitate supports to adults who experience intellectual disabilities. Do you want to move to the next slide? What is a brokerage? So brokerages really came into existence. Margaret was talking about this earlier with the history of Fairview. And actually, this is kind of, I will say, where I started my career more than 20 years ago. I was working with 6 individuals who used to reside previously at Fairview. When they left Fairview Institution, they moved into a group home setting within the community. And so that's really where I started my career at. And it was one of the most profound, life impacting experiences I've ever had. Serving the people who lived in this home and assisting them with getting out in the community and working and going to hang out with friends and all of those things that we do on a day-to-day basis. That really set the course for me to do what I'm doing today. Those individuals really meant a lot to me, and they really helped me understand how deep those abuses really impacted people. On a daily basis, I would see things that these individuals had carried forward with them that they had brought from Fairview that they could not easily let go of. So brokerages really came into existence at that time where Oregon was realizing that institutionalizing people was not the way to go for any number of reasons. And the state of Oregon was sued by individuals, family members, advocates who kind of all got together and indicated institutional settings are not going to continue. They're not going to be there in the future. And there needs to be equitable services provided to individuals who, should not be going into institutional settings, who really can reside in their own communities with support. So brokerages came into existence 20 years ago as a result of grassroots advocacy by advocates, families, community members, and we were really all invested in creating a person-centered approach. The foundation for the brokerages was the Staley settlement, which was based on the Staley-Kitzhaber lawsuit. And that really caused a huge systemic shift in providing services for individuals throughout all 36 counties in Oregon. Do you want to move to the next slide? Scroll down to the right slide on my end. Okay, so we have all these different acronyms that we use in the developmental disability system, and sometimes it can get very overwhelming. So just as an example, I was sitting in a meeting yesterday and we had lots of parties in this room, and we also had a district attorney in this room, and within about 3 minutes, we dropped 20 different acronyms, and the district attorney was like, okay, everybody just stop. You need to actually define these. And so the first level of acronyms is like what we call case managers. So we have what are called personal agents, PAs. We have service coordinators, which are SCs. We have case managers, which are CMs. So we have all of these different terms, and we all support the same population. Personal agents has a little bit of history to it. Again, this kind of comes back to the Staley-Kitzhaber settlement and the grassroots advocacy that was occurring when brokerages were first being born. Individuals and their families, they really wanted something that kind of stood out as being distinct. A personal agent, I'm here to provide your supports. I'm here for you. I am your navigator. I am your cheerleader. I am your advocate. I am your connector. I'm your case manager, and I'm going to stick with you throughout this process. So that's really what a personal agent does. We meet pretty intensely with people when they are first referred to our agency. We sit down and chat with them about how they want their engagement to look, who they want to sit at their table. We provide assessments. We set up Medicaid funded services. We provide monitoring. We meet people where they are. So we can go and meet them in their own homes. We can meet them in the community. We can meet them at our offices. Whatever is going to work best and make somebody comfortable, we really want to help maximize their level of independence and their level of self-direction and engagement. So in a nutshell, that's what a personal agent does. Next slide. So key challenges. One of the things that, I mean, we really look at somebody's whole life, right? So when people enroll with us, we are looking not only at their disability related needs, which is kind of a key driver to why they have come in our front door and why we're providing supports, but we also really focus on what are the goals that you want to work on and how do we break these out into steps to help you meet your needs. And the majority of individuals who enroll in our program are usually at first living at home with family. And one of the key goals that comes up quite frequently is the fact that people want to live independently. Everybody wants to be treated equally. Everybody wants to be able to have the same access to opportunities. So that's housing, that's work, that's being able to have a relationship that's meaningful to you, all of those pieces. So one of the things that we look at somebody's whole life, and the key challenges in terms of helping individuals we support to find housing really include affordability. Oftentimes property management companies, they want, 2 to 3 times the amount of rent in addition to security deposits. Every time somebody fills out an application, they have to pay an application fee. The individuals that we support, they're often living on Social Security income or Social Security disability income, and maybe some wages as well, but usually not enough to be able to pay for all of those application fees, first and last and deposit, things like that. The wait lists for people are really long. Section 8 vouchers are often not enough to cover the housing costs. And individuals also require support to move, which can be difficult to access. So oftentimes our agency is really thinking creatively. We have another fund that we use that's not Medicaid related to help people when they are ready to move into their own place. If to help. So we do a lot of that legwork and support for people. Will you move to the next slide? So brokerage services, we're really there. I think everything that I've said in the previous slide supports the fact that we are there to support people beyond just those Medicaid funded tasks, just being a case manager. We're really there to develop long-term relationships with people, to listen to people, to look at their safety and basic core needs, their connection, their self-esteem, their self-realization, and to put pieces in place to help them accomplish all of those things. Because that really is what it takes to create a safety net for individuals to be able to access their communities successfully. And, one of the stories that I wanted, if you'll move to the next slide, I wanted to just share a quick story of two people that we serve. So Roberto and Joy, they live in Hermiston, and they've been married for 9 years. The last 8 years of their marriage, they've been living in their own apartment, and they both work in the community. So Roberto has a long history, more than a decade now, of working at the Hermiston Walmart. And he's not only a cart pusher, but he's also a senior employee. So he trains other people on how to do this job. He's also very flexible. So he's willing to fill in as needed in other roles within Walmart. And his wife, Joy, has worked for Delish for about 5 years now. She's currently a dishwasher, but she's learning other tasks. And, they both very much love their jobs. They're very motivated to work. They always show up on time. They are dedicated, motivated, just the kind of people that you want to have working for you. And they live independently on their own. And they do this with the support of a team of people. That includes their personal agent, that includes family members, that includes their employer, that includes their houser. So all of these people really come together in different ways to help them be successful. And if you'll move on to the next slide. This is just telling you, hey, we have brokerage services that are serving all 36 counties. We serve roughly 8,000 Oregonians. This is just kind of a list of the brokerages that are operating in Oregon. We have Connections Case Management, Full Access High Desert, UCP, SDRI. All of these agencies have been around for many years. And this is just kind of one half of the system, because we also have case management entities that serve all 36 counties as well. So there are a plethora of services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to be successful in housing, living on their own, being integrated. They really just need the opportunities. We need a bridge between case management entities and housing providers to help people find housing and be able to be part of their community successfully. And I think that's it for me, unless people have questions. Again, it feels very odd. I'm just speaking to my presentation and I can't see anybody in the room. So
Thank you, Laura. We're going to do questions at the end,
yeah.
but thank you so much. We hang in there because you'll want to continue the conversation. Trell Anderson is going to share with us next.
I'm Trell Anderson.
Can you continue with the slide?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm Trell Anderson. I'm the executive director at Northwest Housing Alternatives. We are a nonprofit housing developer and housing provider. We have a portfolio of rental housing across the state of about 2,000 units. We have about 600 units under construction around the state, but we also have a portfolio of group homes that were referenced here. Our intersection into the history here is when the Stanley settlement was made. There was funding for nonprofits to purchase large single family homes around the state to operate as group homes. And Northwest Housing Alternatives over the years accumulated a portfolio of, I think we're at 65 homes now across the state. I just wanted to share some of our overall demographics. This is our census report for our multifamily housing portfolio, just so you get a sense of our scale and who we serve. Our portfolio consists of family housing, senior housing, housing for people with veterans and people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So this is just a representation of the multifamily portfolio we have integrated in here, but behind those red dots are also the group homes. So this was just to give you, again, a sense of size and scale and I guess geography of the range that we cover and provide housing throughout. Next slide, please. This is the census of our group home residents. So while we, just a distinction here, we start to get into this systems conversation. We own the asset and the property, but we lease these to different service providers, different than brokerages that we just heard about. And part of what I'm going to speak to in a minute is this whole system alignment component. I was asking Terry, we're sitting up here and I'm still learning the difference between the brokerages and service providers. But we lease all of our group homes to different service providers, 19 different service providers around the state. Their role is to support the residents in the group homes. Our role is to ensure that that physical asset is sound and solid and current and modernized and is always going to be there as a housing portfolio for people in this group home model. And this is our demographics of the residents who live in those group homes being supported by those service providers. Next slide, please. So this is the systems part. So I've been doing housing and community development my whole career here in Oregon. Was kind of on the early stages with Margaret and Terry and others here to set up this permanent supportive housing model that we're pretty familiar with. You know, it's talked about as a three-legged stool. It needs all three of these components to come together and synchronize and talk to each other to make permanent supportive housing occur. Unit affordability. So we need to make sure that either by the initial capital subsidy or by project basing vouchers or Section 8 coming into the property, that affordability is a very key component. You heard Laura speak to that, right? As affordability is a problem for the brokerage firms and the people that they work with. Moving clockwise, having rental properties with dedicated units. Terry's going to talk about the difference, I think, between dedicated and prioritizing wait lists. But in the PSH model, permanent supportive housing model, as we know it and talk about it in homeless services, the equation is to dedicate units to people who are transitioning from homelessness. So we might dedicate 20 out of a 100-unit building, for example, and we dedicate those by project basing a voucher to it or identifying that the units in the building at 30% or below AMI are dedicated to people transitioning from homelessness, right? So it's incumbent upon the property owner and developer to dedicate those units and instruct property management. These are dedicated units to people transitioning from homelessness. And again, I'm using the next slide. We'll see a parallel here. And then the last is supportive services. Supportive housing, permanent supportive housing just doesn't work without supportive services. We can do affordable housing all day long, but if you want to dedicate these units as permanent supportive housing, we need a strong partnership with a strong service provider supporting people moving from homelessness into permanent housing. And so the sidebars are kind of the different, when I say the funders to the unit affordability, there's your inventory of where, you know, we would turn to for those resources. When we say sponsors, that's our role. That would be Northwest Housing Alternatives as a property sponsor. Those are, you know, the different roles that we're playing. And then the service providers come from, you know, a lot of different angles. And sometimes we'll have 3 or 4 service providers, you know, supporting residents in a permanent supportive housing unit in any particular designated building. So this is the system that I'm familiar with in affordable housing. And so as we're convening, Cooney Foundation is convening us to talk about what are other housing opportunities and housing models for us to explore. You know, group homes serve a purpose, but they're not the end all be all. You heard Laura talk about the problems that brokerages have and service providers have of working with people in the community. So, you know, we're having a dialogue about what are other housing models that we can pursue and try to set up. And so I said, well, we know the PSH model. Could that translate to housing people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Next slide, please. So here's how that system looks. I mean, it's the same components basically. And, you know, when I hear Laura talk, you know, 2 of the things she talked about were affordability. The second was about access, right? You know, she didn't talk about services because she's a brokerage and the service provider. They got that handled, right? But it's the alignment between rent subsidies or very affordable units in the system, alignment to access systems to those units, and how do we create that same kind of 3-pronged approach to system alignment to further housing opportunities for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's what this tries to represent. We use the red text to kind of explore or expand the different components of this, you know, 3-legged stool, this 3-legged approach to permanent. We changed the name a little bit. Supportive SLH, supported living housing. Okay. I'm confused sometimes. but again, for me, what this brings forward, and one of the things when Cooney Foundation convened us like 3 years ago, what occurred to me is that in this PSH model, we have dedicated a lot of the housing and a lot of the resources, again, to people transitioning from homelessness. And we have talked about aligning mental health systems, and all of the policies work in that direction. And it's been, I don't know, we're going on 20 years of trying to align all of these systems, right? And what occurred to me is that there's nothing in PSH that speaks to people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities, some of the most at risk of homelessness, of the impact of not being able to access housing. And none, if you look through all the public policy, you look through the all of the community development block grant plans, you look through the state's home funding plan, you look through all the programs that designate how affordable housing funding is supposed to be used, intellectual developmental disabilities does not rank as a priority. And so that was one of the things we identified in this conversation, that we need to somehow bring this to a policy level and discussion so that this model works in the same way, works for people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and coordinating with the brokerages and the service providers in the same way, perhaps, that we do with all the homeless services and all the homeless service providers. So that's what this is trying to represent, and just to show how that approach, using a systems approach, coordinating resources, may work in the work we have to do in system alignment. Next slide, please. So I think, Terry, we're handing it over to you now to present a real life bricks and sticks project. Q&A after that. Thank you.
So my name is Terry Silvas, and I am the least prepared for this. My colleagues have set me up really well. So is a little closer. Okay. My voice typically carries, so if this is too loud, let me know. So I am the CEO of Horizon Project, and we're a service provider in Umatilla County. We provide residential 24-hour, 7-day-a-week group homes, supported living, employment services, community living supports to people with IDD. We function and provide all the supports that you heard Laura talk about, except we employ the direct service workers and make sure that they are assigned and trained to support the people in their homes, in the group homes, out in the field with job coaching, whereas brokerages are pretty much employed by the person. So we move people around to fit the needs of the collective, so to speak. But we achieve the same goals. The odd thing is that I have, 25 years in affordable housing development. So I can tell you all the acronyms, and I can talk across all the languages now, which has been no small feat. So I've been doing this job for almost 7 years, and I'm happy to say we're trying to make some inroads, and we're learning a lot with some really great development partners. And in Pendleton, we are now building the first in Eastern Oregon, a 70-unit integrated supported living project. So here we go. So if you could move to the next slide, please. So this is South Hill Commons. South Hill Commons is 70 units. And in that project, we have a preference for up to 10 units to support people living with independently supported services that you've heard described. And HPI will have a group home that is also designed and integrated and built within that complex. This is a rendition. Thank you to Carlton Hart Architects for putting together the slideshow, because I'm abysmal at it. And it is built on, well, it was free land from the city of Pendleton on a slope. It's the most, yay! It's the most expensive free land we've ever had. But the site, the retaining walls are huge. But LMC's getting it built and it looks great. We plan to open our doors in Q1 2024, and you'll learn more about our partner soon. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, is that better? God, that sounds so loud. Okay, so do I have to repeat everything I just said? Oh, good, nice. So here's the site plan. What you're going to notice in this is there are lots of ramps. We did utilize numerous universal design principles, took a deep dive into that. We had some support from the Cooney Foundation and the Fairview Trust to make sure this come to a reality. We had lots of discussions around the table with Carlton Hart Architects and DCM Communities and me explaining this is what we need to achieve. Here's the lingo. This is what it needs to look like. Here's what we've learned by building group homes. It needs to be age in place. It needs to be low barrier. We need every unit to have 36-inch wide doors because someday somebody's going to need to get a walker in there. And by the way, when we put in a roll-in shower, no lip on the shower. People fall over that. So we talked a lot about what can be integrated within units that will make sure people are safe as they live independently. And that's anybody. And if you were at the last session, you heard us talk about that. So that's what universal design is about. I don't think I'll go through the list of universal design principles. People like Community Vision have a universal design tool that's made accessible to all. There are people in the design world that can talk about that better than me, but this was a big, big initiative and this was a focus and it's not been done before. I don't think outside of the metro area. So I think we may be the first rural area to experience, to be able to access this type of property design. Next slide, please. Yet again, a nice visual that shows you the extensive ramping system. What you're going to see in the red is the communal areas. That includes, of course, exterior areas as well as a community center, which will have all the things that you think about in a community center, but yet again, designed for people of all abilities, for aging in place, for little children to go play in the safe space. And the dark blue are going to be the multifamily units, of course. The light blue are those units that you'll see more accessibility in. So we have, I forget the percentage. We have a significant percentage architects of fully accessible units. And I think it's certainly much more than the 7. I think it's more like 10% or 12% of our units are fully accessible, with everything else being, again, adaptable because everyone gets wide doorways. So everyone can get in, and ramps and elevators, etc. Next slide, please. Okay. Well, what does that say, Jennifer? Huh. Okay, next slide, please. So here's some pictures during construction. All right, I don't know if one of these is a retaining. You don't see the huge one in back, but you'll see the ramping system as it's going up. And I'm telling you, we got retaining walls that are 16 feet high. So again, yeah. 50-foot grade drop from one side of the property to the other. Thank you, civil engineers. But we're making it work because I said we can't have a lot of steps. We can't have a lot of steps. We need more ramps. And so that's what we've got. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to say thank you to, there are so many people that are making this happen. Of course, Oregon Housing, this is financed with 4% tax credits and lift bonds, and it's got, donated land. The county was very, very helpful in the permitting process. Raymond James is our investor. Cooney Foundation, and the Fairview Trust helped put money behind the special amenities that are included. Umpqua Bank is our lender. Cruise Construction, I call it here because this really nice single family home builder is building our group home, and he's working in the middle of a construction zone. He's pretty incredible, and he hasn't done this before, and he's just jumped right in. Capco is our other service provider, and of course DCM Communities, Carlton Hart, and LMC have been in with this with me from the beginning and said, what are we doing? I said, well, we're going to figure it out. So that's what we're doing. So that's it. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Terry. Excellent. Let me start with a provocative question before we turn it over to your provocative questions. So to the panel, and this may be more to Trell and Terry because they're more deeply embedded in the kind of the affordable housing world than Laura is. Although Laura, if you have anything you want to offer, by all means. I guess I want to just kind of reflect on a little bit of the systems change you were talking about, Trell, and about the cobbling together. You're masterful at it, Terry, and both of you are, but the number of sources of money that have to go into every transaction. And just to reflect on this moment when scarcity of money, it for sure in the Portland metro area is not our problem, right? Scarcity of dollars is not our problem, even in Oregon, because the legislature has appropriated really unprecedented amounts of money for affordable housing and particularly for deeply affordable housing. And I just wondered if and there's a panel tomorrow to talk specifically about policy advocacy, but I wondered if either of you had any kind of reflections on kind of how do we take that conversation to the next level when we don't have to be in a zero-sum game mindset to really go big on IDD housing and supported living options. So here, I'll give you my mic and see who wants to say something.
Well, can you go back to that slide with the 3 rings?
With the red writing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, with the red writing, the second slide of the three rings. This is the system alignment piece that I think you're talking about. And I guess I have first an acknowledgement that the system alignment's really hard because in housing, we're place-based, right? We have an address, we have a deed, we have a loan, a mortgage to pay. We're kind of grounded there for at least 30 years or 99 years, depending on the funding source, right? A lot of the support services are people-based and they're designed to move with people and support people wherever they go, right? And so the challenge is always, how do you align a system that is people-based and ask that system to say, could you project-base some of your resources? Can you dedicate some of your resources to this address for the next 30 years? And then how do you open up the housing system to say, you know what, we got to set aside and support a number of people that, are going to be different than the rest of the units, right? And so you're asking both systems to really change how they operate and how they think. And we're there mostly in homeless services kinds of systems. It's taken a long time for housing authorities to project base in alignment with supportive housing for people transitioning from homelessness. I mean, a long time, right, to get that concept. It's a national movement now. It's all going well. It's the same question though, in the healthcare system, for example, and I think we're making some inroads and some progress, with Medicaid waivers and, that whole discussion. It's starting to happen. Not feeling it yet in this smaller system, this system that's almost not visible to so many other people who aren't in it because of a loved one or personal investment in it, right? There's really not the profile of the service system for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that the homeless service system has, for example. And so this question of how do you dedicate both housing, which is a place-based system, to people, which is, person-based system, hasn't quite integrated into our discussion here. I think it has to, though, for us to be able to collaborate and coordinate resources to do all the things that, we know work well. Stable housing is the foundation to everything. I'm a housing advocate. I will say that to the day I die, right? And so if people aren't able to use their other resources to access housing, that's a problem we still have to solve. I don't have a solution other than to say, let's keep convening. Let's keep talking. Thank you, Cooney, for giving us this opportunity. This is the system's work that I think has to be done.
Yeah, I think that I'm trying to think of what I can add to that. Why do I not like this thing? Okay. So I think, what we need to continue to do is have these conversations that, again, Cooney has assembled. And it's a demystification of the differences in nomenclature that we use and the systems that we have in place. And in too many cases, and our friends from Washington will talk about this tomorrow in the Washington state case, but we have the housing system, we have the IDD system, and the two are not integrating at all. And the beauty of the IDD system, as Laura says, is the individuals we support come with entitlements. They come with all the services you're looking for to make sure people are living independently and stably in the units that you've invested billions of dollars in. And often in PSH units, it's that support services piece, as you will know, that will fall by the wayside because of social service providers lost funding for this person or that funding. We have funding. We have dedicated state and federal funding to make sure people are supported. And the frustrating for me is someone who has developed housing for more than I want to tell you, and now has been working intensely in this world for the last 7 years, is the people we support don't qualify for permanent supportive housing, yet they too are like anybody else that is at risk of homelessness, except for example, someone living in my group home, they will be on the street. Now they may not, like if you were in the other session, you would have heard stories of people moving from group homes into independent supported living, which is the gold standard. But is the choice really got to be a group home or the streets before they can qualify for permanent supportive housing? Because that's the system we've got. Okay, now I'm going to let you go.
Okay, see, there you go.
Mark, there is a piece that I can add to this as
please
well.
do.
In terms of Charles' slide talking about funders. So one of the things that I didn't hit on in my portion of the presentation is the Fairview Advisory Trust Board. And so the Fairview Advisory Board was brought about due to the closure and sale of institutions in the state of Oregon. And there is set aside funds for housing developers to be able to apply to and to increase the number of units that are available for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we actually just had the housing round open. It closed on August 31st. But this is an opportunity for investors or others to really look at these funds that have been set aside to assist with developments that you may already have moving forward, but you need some additional funds to kind of bring the project together. It allows you to have a specialized focus for some individuals within that housing to be specific to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have 3 different pots that we focus on. So we're really focused on increasing housing in the state of Oregon, specific to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, advocacy, which is another pot that we have that really focuses on those systems that Trell was talking about and bringing some of those pieces together so that things are more seamless, as well as universal design, which Terry sort of started to hit on in her presentation of what they're doing with the property that they are building currently. So, you know, there are funds available and it would be great to be able to look at the Fairview Housing Trust as a resource in any of the projects that you guys are considering. We have quite a bit of funds. We have a dedicated amount of funding set aside in 2 funds, and then we have some additional funding that is coming in right now that is really going to be, it needs to be spent within a specific time frame, and so there are plenty of funding opportunities there. That's what I'll say.
Not a moment of scarcity. Thank you,
No,
Laura.
there's not.
Not a moment of scarcity. So I think at this point, we will open it up for questions from this group or from the Zoom room. And Robin's got a microphone she'll bring to you if you've got a question or an observation you'd like to share with the room.
Hi, thanks. I'm recently in charge of developing permanent supportive housing for Washington County Housing Authority. And I'm curious about the kind of conjunction of permanent supportive housing and this independent living supported housing models? Is this something that we can, work together and have these coexisting in single developments?
So is your question, is it, so there's a kind of traditional, if you will, PSH definition, which, Trell described very well. And is your question, is it feasible to have set asides both for PSH and for IDD within a single development? Is that?
Yes.
Mhm.
Would it make sense for us to, pull from the end, say Fairview, and dedicate a third of these units for would those models overlap well? Do they make good neighbors, I guess?
I think so.
Here you go.
Oh, yeah, this thing again. Yeah, I think that I'm going to fumble over this answer, so let's bear with me. So the beautiful answer would be if people with IDD, because of their in general at-risk housing status by default, often either because their caregiver is aging or they're in a group home, but for that they would be on the streets. If there was a way to make sure that that definition also satisfied permanent supportive housing, because even though we don't need, and one of my colleagues said this, our people come with services, right? So you don't have to worry about that. But our people struggle with affordability and cannot access anything except everyone else, a Section 8 voucher or a 811 voucher if you're so fortunate to have them integrated into your housing complex like Albertina Kerr, which is great. But PSH vouchers don't work with our people. They just don't qualify. And I think that's a tragedy. That's one more tool. So they also don't get to benefit from the increased affordability that the capital that PSH brings. Having said that, if you've got a complex that does have PSH units in them, there's nothing to prevent someone from integrating universal design in that and tapping into those resources that we are increasingly having available for that. And what I would say, creating even a preference for individuals with living with IDD. What we've done at South Hill Commons is we do not have a hard set aside. Now, I chose not to have a hard set aside because we are not in the Portland metro area. The pool of potential supported living individuals is just smaller. And so what we are doing in our tenant selection plan is we are putting in a preference for up to a minimum of X number of units for families or individual families with children that are living with IDD or adults coming to us with supports. And those people get popped up to the top of the wait list. Okay. And especially if they have a need for accessible units, they get popped up to the top of the wait list. I structured it that way because we haven't done this in rural Oregon before. And the last thing my investor wants is a credit recapture. So I want to make sure we've got some flexibility. I would encourage people getting into this to think very carefully about whether you're using the word set aside and preference. Housing developers use set aside one way. Social services think about it a different way. So that definition needs to be very clear with all the funders. And we went through that discussion a lot with Raymond James and Umpqua Bank explaining the difference. So short answers, well, I guess the long answer is yes. So, yeah.
I would add, just as a multifamily housing developer and provider, it depends. We have experience in several properties where the higher the percentage of PSH units, the more we need very strong resident services and support. And without it, the whole thing starts to teeter. So I would say the bigger the property, the better it'll work. The smaller the property, the integrated model works, I think, less effectively.
Other questions?
Thanks. To what extent is, because there's such a focus on PSH through all of the funding rounds, and to what extent do people in communities not, especially developers, not know about this need and the accompanying resources and what, how does that work happen?
I'm going to tell my own personal testimonial on that one, Kate. I had a very big job with a lot of responsibility for housing policy and funding in the state of Oregon. I ran OHCS for close to 5 years. I had no idea. I thought I was a subject matter expert, baby. I was like, you can't tell me anything I haven't already seen. And then I got acquainted with the folks like Trell running what's called the KIP homes, the Community Integration Program homes. And I got acquainted with Cooney and I read the data study and I went, oh my God, I had no idea. So I don't know if I'm a proxy for anybody else in the state of Oregon, but it was an eye opener. And I think the fact that that the state agencies don't even talk to each other. I love me some state agencies. I am a proud former bureaucrat, and they don't talk to each other. And so the way the funding systems work don't encourage you to think beyond kind of what's right in front of us. And what's right in front of us as an industry right now is PSH for good reason. There's plenty of money. Okay, there was a little, I thank you for letting me get up here on a soapbox.
Service providers and housing providers in communities, is that something that's happening? Did you plan for?
We're going to let Robin Shuey from Cooney take a stab at that. The answer is yes, and it's slow going.
I'll echo that. Yes, it is slow going, but we look at this conference as a great way to start and continue that conversation. And we're trying to set new tables. So getting in front of the different agencies out there and trying to get them to start to talk to each other. We have extraordinary partners. We try to sit back and let them lead and share their expertise and their connections and all of that. We're just there to really try and help set the table. So thank you for being at this session. That's an important first step, but let's keep these dialogues going forward and forward.
And could I also go ahead, Charlie? Go ahead.
You can also.
I can also. I just can't stop myself. So who in the room is a housing developer or works for an organization that develops or owns housing? Who in the room is a service provider? Who in the room is specifically an IDD service provider? Okay, see the problem? So if you're a housing developer and you're open to thinking about how your next project maybe could include some units for which there is plenty of money, please see one of these guys, right?
Kate, I'd add a policy piece to this. So the profile of homelessness and the policy that's created around it is really also driving what gets developed and funded. And we have to chase that. We have to, the properties, the projects, the proposals that we bring forward for funding has to reflect the policy priorities. And still, I mean, that's one of the things we realize we need to integrate and elevate is a policy priority for housing for people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Ty, I think you're next.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, my bad if my voice carries, but from a policy perspective, does the landscape look different for developing supportive housing in rural counties versus urban areas? And are the hurdles within that any different as well too?
I'm going to answer the question with a question. So is the concern that the policies surrounding either housing, financing access, or policies surrounding service funding access different? Or both?
Could I do all the above?
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure I got an answer, but we'll go with that. Because of the way services for people experiencing IDD are funded, and that's through Medicaid funding, what's funneled down to the state, which is added to by state funding, and that funnels out to service providers like Horizon Project or brokerage in a variety of ways. The services funding is pretty stable. In fact, it's increasing over the last few years because as an industry, we've been in front of legislatures reminding them, but for us, providing services to people with IDD. More people are on the streets, more people are at risk of housing, and we are a stabilizing factor. And guess what? There are no institutions left, and that's because of us. So we actually do the work now that the state used to do in a very poor manner. So no, as long as someone can get pointed to where they can get an intake and get qualified for the services, as Laura said before, it's an entitlement and the money for services flows. And in like any other housing development in rural Oregon, the funding for the capital is cobbled together like everything else, right? I found, at least in Pendleton, what we were able to do is what was kind of ironic. Pendleton wanted housing, and they wanted affordable housing, and they wanted workforce housing, and they want executive housing. They just want housing. So we had a public sector driven by the city manager and this mayor that was very focused on this. And I was able to say, and guess what? I can help you with that housing issue. But you got to include, but there's going to be people with developmental disabilities. We'll help Capco with some preferences for homeless families. It's got to be housing for everyone. And so I think to answer that second question is same kind of funding sources, but getting the public sector, the local people involved and on board, then you're going to be able to get things like free land, or can you reduce fees? And of course, talk to the tax assessor, all the things you'd normally do. But when you bring the IDD community to the table, you got a whole new set of advocates that are helping you make that argument. So there.
There's, Rachel's got one back there.
Presentation. I think what you know is talking about is the combination of the state units and accessibility.
I think what you're all talking about is the combination of 30% units and accessibility.
And we also know that there are ways to save units.
And we all know that there are way too few 30% AMI units.
And sometimes people with income over 30% get and units.
And that sometimes people who have over 30% AMI get the 30% AMI units.
And this also happens in terms of accessibility.
And this also happens in terms of accessibility.
People are starting to modify units. I buy the units.
People who don't need those modified units occupy those units.
And really the way to support people with disabilities to get into them.
And there's really no way to support people with disabilities to get into them.
I feel like there is a scarcity issue here.
So I feel like there is a scarcity issue here.
And one has a property manager in the room
I'm wondering if there's property managers in the room
who have solutions to that issue.
who have solutions to that issue.
Do we have anybody representing a property management company in the room? Anybody with insight into kind of those leasing questions and
And to just kind of dovetail on that is part of the reason why you were mentioning about the language of set aside versus prioritized or preference. And it's because of that recapture.
Okay, so yes, everything, the concern is like any other low income person that needs a 30% unit, there's a scarcity of that for sure. And there is also, because there's a need to fill our units to make sure that we can meet all of our financial obligations and performances to fill units, even if it means someone without a disability is in an ADA unit. There's no magic bullet for that. What we're trying to do is integrate universal design so that there are more accessible units and adaptable units, so that, and even, age in place units, again, things like a 36-inch wide door is easy to integrate from the beginning, so that if our ADA units are occupied, there are other options that are livable to people of multitude abilities, right? So that's one approach. The other approach is, yes, at South Hill Commons, we do not have set asides, but we would have what I call strong preferences, which means when someone that wants to live in their own apartment with supports, that is already qualified for and getting or going to get in-home support services, they go to the top of that list. And so if we've got a unit and there's a wait list and we're doing lease up, they get a preference and they go to the top of that list. And if we don't have a unit list, they go to the top for when we do. So without putting our financial operations at great risk, we're working to resolve that issue as much as we can, because when the property's at risk, nobody gets a housing unit. So, yeah.
I'm going to overcommit into the NHA staff here. I apologize. Here's the setup maybe for next year's conference based on your question. Thank you very much for that. We have a rental housing portfolio of nearly 2,000 units. I would like for us, as one of our next equity projects, Ty, to go in and assess the units, how they're occupied, that are, have the ADA accessibility. You already talked about it. You're ahead of me. Good job. I love it. Let's do that inventory and let's do that assessment. And there's something here about fair housing as well that crosses into the financial pressures that we have to lease units. But let's do that inventory and that assessment, and we'll propose a workshop next year on this.
That's good.
Okay.
excellent. And I think we have Rachel. Rachel, you want to have the last question
I only want the last question, but I'll do it anyway.
do it anyway.
Hi, everyone. I actually am really glad you brought up scarcity, because I've been thinking a lot about that and how it shows up in so many different ways. Even though we do have new resources coming, we really are in a place where the need for housing is so immense, and then how we direct it. And in that vein, I'm thinking about Kahila House, which I think is one of the last Section 811s that I know of that was built really for people with intellectual disabilities, and in Southwest Portland. And I'm curious about the 811s and those old HUD, those old HUD programs. And like, do we think that there's ever a possibility for some of those kinds of communities to come back, where it's 100% focused on the on those populations, and also where they come with that voucher so that everybody living there has only to pay 30% of their income for rent.
Starting that. So I'm gonna start with a question. I am not familiar with Gila House. Is that a group home or is that an apartment complex? It's an apartment complex. And 811, and it's 100%. Okay, so I will say that one person who has a great deal of experience about this recently is Allison from Albertina Kerr. In the last session, she talked about their 150 unit complex, which does have 30 811 vouchers, and they are set aside because they are supporting people with IDD and with some incredible amenities. Why her predecessor started her off with 150 units, I don't know. That's a big chunk for your first project, but you're doing a great job. So yes, there is room for 811 vouchers for sure to be integrated in a way that helps resolve part of that. And they are dedicated, in this case, to people experiencing IDD. If they're ever, I don't think any of you are going to be developing group homes, but let me tell you, don't do it with HUD and 811 vouchers. It's a nightmare. Never do that. If someone asks you, just say no, and I'll tell you why, but I won't take up your time with that. But integrated supported living, yes. So yeah.
So we're going to need to wrap, and I want to just call out that tomorrow we have 3 more panels that really center on these questions around housing access for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have one on advocacy that features our neighbors to the north, Stacy Dim and some colleagues from hers who have made some tremendous strides with policy advocacy with their legislature and executive branch. We also have a panel that talks about some innovative models using ADUs, and Jennifer Knapp will be one of the panelists on that. And then we also have a fair housing panel tomorrow afternoon. So all of those are in this room and on the kind of IDD track. So hope to see you back tomorrow. Thank you for your interest and for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, you guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Laura.